The notification pinged on my phone just as I was reviewing the final evidence package that would shut down the largest medical fraud ring in Oregon's history. Sarah Mitchell, Senior Investigator, Medical Fraud Division. 6 years of clawing my way up from insurance claims processor to the woman who catches people who exploit sick patients for profit. The irony of what I was about to read would have been funny if it wasn't so perfectly predictable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ms. Mitchell, this is Jennifer Walsh from GoFundMe's fraud prevention team. We need to discuss a campaign that was run in your name 6 years ago. There are some serious discrepancies we've uncovered, and we believe you may have been a victim of fraud. Can you call me immediately? I stared at the message, then slowly swiveled my chair toward the window overlooking downtown Portland. 23 floors below, people hurried through their Monday morning routines, completely unaware that somewhere in this city, my brother Jake was probably waking up in a panic. Because if GoFundMe was reaching out to me directly about that campaign, it meant they'd finally connected the dots I'd been waiting 6 years for them to find. Marcus knocked on my office door, holding a fresh stack of files. The Henderson case just got 3 more victims coming forward. Looks like our fake cancer diagnosis ring is bigger than we thought. He paused, noticing my expression. Everything okay, boss? I held up my phone. Remember how I told you I got into this line of work for personal reasons? The brother who screwed you over during your cancer treatment? GoFundMe just called. They want to talk about a campaign run in my name 6 years ago. I watched Marcus's eyebrows rise. Apparently, there were some discrepancies they finally discovered. No kidding. What kind of discrepancies? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. The kind where $85,000 gets raised for someone's cancer treatment, but that someone never sees a penny of it because her loving brother decides his gourmet food truck dream is more important than her chemotherapy bills. Marcus whistled low. And now he's probably facing fraud charges. Federal fraud charges. Wire fraud, mail fraud, and if I'm reading the signs correctly, probably conspiracy charges too, since Ashley was involved in running the campaign. I set my phone down and pulled up Jake's information on my computer. Want to know the beautiful part? He's going to need a lawyer who specializes in medical fraud cases. Someone who understands the federal statutes, the penalties, the way these investigations work. Someone exactly like you. Someone exactly like me. I opened the Henderson file, scanning through the evidence we'd compiled against the cancer fraud ring. Except I'm not a defense attorney, Marcus. I'm the person who builds the cases that send people like my brother to prison. The phone rang again. Jennifer Walsh from GoFundMe. Right on schedule. I let it ring 3 times before answering, my voice professionally neutral. Sarah Mitchell speaking. Ms. Mitchell, thank you for taking my call. I'm calling about a GoFundMe campaign titled Help Sarah Fight Cancer that was created in October 2018. Our fraud detection algorithms have flagged several irregularities, and we need to verify some information with you. What kind of irregularities? Well, the campaign raised $85,412 over 6 months. The funds were withdrawn in stages, but none of the withdrawals correspond to medical facilities, treatment centers, or any healthcare-related expenses. Instead, we're seeing transfers to business accounts, equipment purchases, and what appears to be commercial real estate deposits. I closed my eyes, remembering those months when I was too sick from chemo to even check my email regularly, let alone monitor a fundraising campaign I never knew existed. I see. And you're reaching out now because? Because we've been contacted by federal investigators working a case involving fraudulent medical fundraising. Your campaign was flagged as part of a broader investigation into systematic abuse of crowdfunding platforms for medical fraud. We need to determine if you were aware of the campaign and authorize the withdrawals. I was not aware there was a campaign in my name, and I certainly didn't authorize any withdrawals. The words came out steady, professional, but inside I felt that familiar burn of controlled rage that had fueled every promotion, every certification, every late night studying for my fraud investigation credentials. Ms. Mitchell, I have to ask, are you the same Sarah Mitchell who works for the Oregon State Medical Fraud Investigation Unit? I smiled for the first time that morning. I am indeed. And I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation. 6 years ago, I thought I was fighting the battle of my life against stage 3 breast cancer. I was 26, working as an insurance claims processor, living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment in Salem. The diagnosis hit me like a freight train. Not just the cancer itself, but the crushing reality of what it would cost to survive. The second call that morning was the one I'd been expecting. Marcus buzzed my office phone with barely contained excitement in his voice. "Sarah, there's a Jake Mitchell on line 3. Says he's your brother and it's urgent family business." I stared at the blinking light on my phone, letting it pulse 3, 4, 5 times before picking up. 6 years of building myself into the kind of person who could handle this exact moment, and here it was. "This is Sarah Mitchell, Senior Investigator, Medical Fraud Division." "Sarah, thank God. Look, I know we haven't talked in a while, but I really need your help. Something crazy is happening with some old GoFundMe thing, and the FBI showed up at my apartment this morning with a warrant." His voice carried that same entitled panic I remembered from when we were kids, and he'd broken something expensive, expecting me to cover for him with Mom. The difference was that now I wasn't 12 years old and terrified of getting him in trouble. Now I was the person who got people like him in trouble professionally. "A GoFundMe thing," I repeated, my voice neutral. "Which GoFundMe thing would that be, Jake?" "You know, the one we set up when you were sick. The fundraiser to help with your medical bills. Apparently there's some kind of investigation, and they're saying I committed fraud or something." "It's insane, Sarah. You know I would never do anything to hurt you." I pulled up his file on my computer while he talked, scanning through the preliminary report that had crossed my desk just that morning. The federal task force had been thorough. Bank records, business registrations, equipment purchases, lease agreements for the food truck location. Everything neatly documented and traced back to the GoFundMe withdrawals that should have paid for my chemotherapy. "Jake, let me make sure I understand what you're telling me. You're saying there was a GoFundMe campaign set up to help with my medical expenses during my cancer treatment?" "Well, yeah. Ashley and I created it right after you got diagnosed. We thought it would help take some of the financial pressure off while you were dealing with everything else. Family looking out for family, you know?" There it was. The casual rewriting of history that narcissists were so skilled at. In Jake's version, he and Ashley were the thoughtful relatives who'd stepped up to help in my time of need. The fact that I'd never known about the campaign, never received a penny of the money, and had nearly declared bankruptcy paying for treatment that insurance didn't cover, those were just minor details that didn't fit his narrative. "And where did the money from this campaign go, Jake?" Silence. Then the sound of him clearing his throat, buying time to construct whatever lie he thought might work on me. "Well, the thing is, Sarah, the medical billing was really complicated, and you were so sick we didn't want to bother you with all the financial stuff. So Ashley and I set up a system where we'd handle the payments directly to make sure everything got taken care of." I clicked through to the evidence photos on my screen. Pictures of the commercial kitchen equipment he'd purchased 3 months into my chemo. The lease agreement for the food truck location, signed 4 months after my diagnosis. The business license for Fusion Street Gourmet filed while I was in the middle of radiation treatments, working double shifts at the insurance office between appointments because I couldn't afford to take time off. "That's interesting, Jake, because I have my medical records right here, and it shows that I paid for all my treatment myself. Made payment plans with the hospital, maxed out credit cards, took a second job even while I was in chemo. But according to these records, someone was withdrawing money from a GoFundMe campaign in my name during that same time period, $85,000 to be precise." "Sarah, look, I can explain everything. The business was supposed to be an investment. I was going to pay back every penny once Fusion Street took off. You have to understand, I saw an opportunity to turn that money into something bigger, something that could help both of us long term." "You saw an opportunity to steal money that people donated thinking they were helping me pay for cancer treatment, and you used it to start a food truck business that failed within 8 months. It wasn't stealing. It was an investment strategy, and the business didn't fail because the concept was bad. We just had some cash flow issues and bad timing with the location permits. If I'd had a little more capital, it would have worked." I leaned back in my chair, marveling at his ability to reframe blatant theft as a failed entrepreneurial venture. "Jake, federal agents searched your apartment this morning because wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy charges carry sentences of up to 20 years each. This isn't about cash flow issues or location permits. This is about you systematically stealing money that was donated specifically for medical expenses while I was fighting for my life. But you're okay now. You beat the cancer, you've got this great job, everything worked out fine. And I have family, Sarah. Whatever mistakes I made, I'm still your brother. That has to count for something. The audacity was breathtaking. Because I'd survived cancer and built a career despite his betrayal, somehow that made the betrayal acceptable. Because we shared DNA, I was supposed to overlook the fact that he'd stolen from people who thought they were helping a cancer patient. You're absolutely right, Jake. Everything did work out fine. I survived cancer, earned my master's degree in healthcare administration while working full-time, completed law enforcement certification, and spent the last 4 years building a reputation as one of the most effective medical fraud investigators in the state. And do you know what my specialty is? What? I catch people who exploit cancer patients for financial gain. I'm very, very good at it. The silence on the phone stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Jake found his voice again. When he spoke, it was with the cautious tone of someone who just realized they might have walked into a trap they'd set for themselves years earlier. Sarah, I think maybe we should talk about this in person. This whole thing is getting blown out of proportion, and phone calls can be misunderstood. Family business should be handled face-to-face, don't you think? I saved the case file I'd been reviewing and turned my attention fully to the conversation that had been 6 years in the making. The beautiful irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Jake calling me for help, just as I was wrapping up the Henderson investigation, a case involving a network of criminals who'd created fake cancer diagnoses to defraud insurance companies and charitable donors. The parallels were so perfect, they felt scripted. Actually, Jake, I think phone calls are exactly the right medium for this conversation. They create documented records, which is something I've learned to appreciate in my line of work. I pulled up the Federal Task Force report on my second monitor, scrolling through the timeline they'd constructed of his activities during my treatment. Besides, I'm curious about something. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You mentioned that you and Ashley handled the medical payments directly, so I wouldn't be bothered with financial details while I was sick. Right, exactly. We were trying to help. Then you'll be able to explain why my medical records show that I personally made every single payment to Salem General Medical Center, including the ones where I had to negotiate payment plans because I couldn't afford the full amounts up front. I clicked through to the hospital billing records that had been subpoenaed as part of the federal investigation. Because according to these documents, no payments were ever made to any medical facility from the GoFundMe account you controlled. The silence returned, longer this time. I could practically hear him scrambling to construct a new version of events that might somehow make sense. When he finally spoke, his voice had shifted from entitled panic to something closer to genuine fear. Look, the medical billing system was really confusing, and there were delays in processing the payments. I was going to reimburse you for everything you paid out of pocket once the business got established and started generating revenue. Jake, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to read you something from the federal investigation report that's currently open on my computer. I navigated to the executive summary, finding the section that laid out the scope of his fraud in clinical detail. Between October 2018 and April 2019, approximately $85,400 was raised through a GoFundMe campaign titled, Help Sarah Fight Cancer. During this same period, the named beneficiary, Sarah Mitchell, was undergoing treatment for stage 3 breast cancer, an accumulated medical debt of over $200,000. Sarah, you don't understand. I'm not finished. The investigation shows that $0 from the campaign were used for medical expenses. Instead, the funds were systematically diverted to support the launch of a commercial food service business, including, but not limited to, $32,000 for commercial kitchen equipment, $28,000 for a food truck vehicle, $15,000 for initial inventory and supplies, and the remainder for business licensing, insurance, and operational expenses. Each number I read aloud was like a nail being driven into a coffin. These weren't abstract accusations anymore. They were specific, documented facts that would be presented to a federal jury if Jake was foolish enough to take this to trial instead of accepting whatever plea deal the prosecutors eventually offered him. The report goes on to note that during the period when these diversions were taking place, the actual beneficiary was working double shifts at her regular job to pay for treatment, had maxed out multiple credit cards to cover medical expenses, and had applied for hardship payment plans with multiple healthcare providers. I paused, letting the weight of those facts settle. Jake, do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand that you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I'm your brother, Sarah. We can work this out between us without involving lawyers and courts and all this legal stuff. The suggestion was so absurd that I actually laughed. Jake, this isn't a family dispute about who borrowed whose car without asking. This is a federal criminal investigation into wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I'm not involved in this as your sister who's upset about family drama. I'm involved as the victim of the crimes you're being charged with. But you work in fraud investigation now. You understand how these things work. There has to be some way to make this go away. Some kind of settlement or agreement. I'll pay back every penny. With interest. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I pulled up Jake's financial records, which the federal task force had helpfully included in their background research. His current assets consisted of a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, a checking account with a balance of $237, and credit card debt that exceeded $15,000. The idea that he could repay $85,000 plus 6 years of interest was mathematically impossible. Jake, even if the federal prosecutors were interested in restitution agreements, which they're not in cases involving systematic fraud, you don't have the financial capacity to repay what you stole. Your entire net worth wouldn't cover 10% of what you took, and that's before calculating interest and penalties. Then what am I supposed to do? Just give up and go to prison? The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered those nights when I'd fallen asleep at my kitchen table, too exhausted from chemo to make it to my bed, surrounded by medical bills I was trying to figure out how to pay while working overtime at a job that barely covered my rent. Jake, 6 years ago, when I was bald from chemotherapy and terrified I might die, you saw people's generosity toward me as an opportunity for personal profit. You took money that strangers donated because they felt compassion for a young woman fighting cancer, and you used it to chase your dream of becoming a food truck entrepreneur. You made that choice deliberately, repeatedly over the course of months. I was trying to build something for both of us. You were trying to build something for yourself, using money that belonged to me. And now you're facing the consequences of that choice. What you're supposed to do is exactly what I had to do 6 years ago when you left me to handle everything alone. Figure it out yourself. The conversation with Jake ended when he realized I wasn't going to be his salvation, and I spent the rest of that afternoon thinking about how different my life had been 6 years ago. October 2018 felt like a lifetime away. Back when I was Sarah Mitchell, the insurance claims processor. Not Sarah Mitchell, the senior investigator who specialized in medical fraud. Back when I believed that family meant something more than shared genetics and childhood memories. I'd been 26 then, living in a cramped studio apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant in downtown Salem. The smell of pho broth would drift up through the floorboards every morning, and I'd learned to love it because it was better than acknowledging how thin the walls were or how the radiator only worked when it felt like it. But the rent was $450 a month, which was what I could afford on my salary processing insurance claims for Pacific Northwest Health Services. The job was mind-numbing but stable. 8 hours a day reviewing medical claims, checking for proper documentation, flagging discrepancies for supervisor review. I'd been there for 3 years since graduating with my bachelor's degree in business administration, and while it wasn't my dream career, it paid the bills and came with health insurance. That health insurance had seemed like a minor perk until the morning I found the lump in my breast during a routine shower. Dr. Patricia Reeves had been gentle but direct when she delivered the diagnosis. Stage 3. Invasive ductal carcinoma. Aggressive treatment would be necessary. Surgery, followed by 6 months of chemotherapy, then radiation. The treatment plan was extensive, the prognosis was good if we acted quickly, and the costs would be substantial, even with insurance coverage. She'd handed me a folder full of information about support groups, financial assistance programs, and treatment options, speaking in that carefully modulated tone that oncologists must learn in medical school. I'd walked out of Salem General Medical Center that day feeling like I was living in someone else's life. 26-year-olds weren't supposed to get breast cancer. People with breast cancer were supposed to have families who rallied around them, support systems that kicked into gear during a crisis. Instead, I had Jake and Ashley, who'd been dating for 2 years and spent most of their time talking about Jake's entrepreneurial ambitions and Ashley's social media marketing strategies. Jake had always been the dreamer in our family. 3 years older than me, he'd bounced between ideas and projects his entire adult life. A landscaping business that lasted 4 months, a cryptocurrency investment scheme that lost money, a plan to flip houses that never got past browsing real estate websites. When our parents died in a car accident during my sophomore year of college, Jake had inherited their emotional support role along with half of their modest life insurance payout. He'd used his portion as a down payment on a duplex in Salem and spent the next few years collecting rent from tenants while working part-time at a sporting goods store. My portion of the insurance money had paid for my final 2 years of college and left me with enough for a small emergency fund that I'd been carefully protecting ever since. The cancer diagnosis changed everything about how I thought about that fund. What had seemed like a reasonable financial cushion suddenly looked woefully inadequate against the reality of cancer treatment costs. The surgery came first, a lumpectomy followed by lymph node removal. Even with insurance, my portion of the hospital bills totaled nearly $8,000. I'd arranged a payment plan with the billing department, promising to pay $200 a month while I figured out how to manage the chemotherapy costs that were coming next. Jake and Ashley had visited me in the hospital after the surgery, bringing flowers and promises that everything would work out fine. Jake had been unusually attentive, asking detailed questions about my treatment plan, my work situation, and how I was planning to manage the financial aspects of everything. At the time, I'd been touched by his concern. It felt like the kind of big brother support I'd always wanted from him, but rarely received. Ashley had been particularly interested in the social media aspects of my situation. She'd suggested creating an Instagram account to document my cancer journey, talking about how powerful it could be to share my story and connect with other young women facing similar diagnoses. She'd shown me examples of other cancer patients who'd built large followings by being open about their experiences, some of whom had successfully raised money for treatment through crowdfunding campaigns. I'd been hesitant about the social media approach. My natural inclination was to handle the cancer privately, to keep working as much as possible and avoid drawing attention to my situation. But Ashley had been persuasive, arguing that there was no shame in accepting help, and that sharing my story might help other people facing similar challenges. She'd offered to help manage the social media accounts if I was too tired from treatment to keep up with posting regularly. The chemotherapy had started 6 weeks after surgery, and that's when the real financial terror had begun. Each treatment session cost nearly $3,000, and my insurance covered 70% if I stayed within their approved network. Even with the insurance coverage, I was looking at $18,000 in out-of-pocket expenses for the chemotherapy alone, not including the additional tests, medications, and follow-up appointments that would be necessary. I'd started working overtime whenever possible, picking up weekend shifts and staying late to process additional claims. The extra hours helped with the immediate expenses, but the fatigue from chemo made everything more difficult. There were days when I'd fall asleep at my desk, jolting awake when my supervisor walked by. There were evenings when I'd come home from treatment so exhausted that I'd eat crackers for dinner because cooking felt impossible. During those months, Jake and Ashley had been supportive in ways that felt meaningful at the time. They'd offered to drive me to appointments when I was too sick to drive myself. Ashley had brought me homemade soup and helped with grocery shopping. Jake had checked in regularly, always asking about my treatment progress and financial situation with what seemed like genuine concern. What I didn't know was that they'd created the GoFundMe campaign 3 days after my first chemotherapy session. The discovery of what Jake and Ashley had done came through the most mundane of circumstances. A routine audit 6 years later that connected dots I never knew existed. But before I could fully understand the scope of their betrayal, I needed to see the campaign they'd created in my name, the words they'd used to exploit my suffering for their personal gain. Jennifer Walsh from GoFundMe had been thorough in her investigation, and when she'd emailed me the complete campaign archive, I'd printed every page. Now, sitting in my downtown Portland apartment with a glass of wine and the federal case file spread across my dining table, I was finally reading the story that Jake and Ashley had told the world about my cancer diagnosis. The campaign title was innocent enough: Help Sarah Fight Cancer. But the description Ashley had written was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that made my stomach turn with every sentence. She described me as a young woman facing cancer alone, which was technically true but ignored the fact that I'd had family who could have helped if they'd chosen to. She detailed my financial struggles with medical bills, painting a picture of someone who was drowning in debt and desperate for assistance. What made it worse was how much of it was actually accurate. Ashley had clearly done her research, including specific details about my treatment plan, my work situation, and even my living arrangement above the Vietnamese restaurant. She'd mentioned that I was working overtime while undergoing chemotherapy, trying to pay for treatment that insurance didn't fully cover. She'd described the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty that came with a cancer diagnosis at 26. But then came the lies that transformed genuine hardship into profit opportunity. Ashley had written that I was too proud to ask for help directly, and that she and Jake were creating the campaign with Sarah's grateful permission to allow friends and family to support me during treatment. She'd promised that every dollar donated would go directly toward medical expenses. And she'd included fake updates about how the donations were being used to pay hospital bills and cover prescription medications. The campaign had raised money steadily over 6 months, with donations ranging from $5 to $500. People had left heartbreaking comments about their own experiences with cancer, their hopes for my recovery, and their gratitude for being able to help someone in need. An elderly woman named Margaret had donated $50 and written that she was a breast cancer survivor herself and wanted to pay forward the kindness she'd received during her own treatment. A college student had donated $10, probably a significant amount for someone living on ramen noodles, and mentioned that her aunt had died from breast cancer and she knew how expensive treatment could be. Reading those comments was like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. These people had opened their hearts and wallets to help someone they'd never met, motivated by pure compassion and generosity. They'd trusted that their money would ease the burden of a young woman fighting for her life. Instead, their donations had funded Jake's dream of becoming a gourmet food truck entrepreneur. The campaign updates Ashley had posted were particularly infuriating. She'd written regular posts thanking donors and providing fake progress reports about how the money was being used. In December 2018, while I was in the middle of my worst chemotherapy cycle, barely able to keep food down and working double shifts to pay for treatment, Ashley had posted an update claiming that the donations had, quote, allowed Sarah to focus on healing instead of worrying about bills. In February 2019, when I was starting radiation and had maxed out my credit cards to cover the copays, she'd written that the community support was making all the difference in Sarah's recovery journey. The most damning evidence was in the withdrawal records that the federal investigators had obtained. Jake had been systematic about moving money from the GoFundMe account to his personal checking account, then immediately transferring it to business accounts he'd set up for Fusion Street Gourmet. The timing was particularly cruel. Some of the largest withdrawals had occurred on the same days I'd been making desperate calls to the hospital billing department, begging for extended payment plans because I couldn't afford the full amounts they were demanding. $28,000 had been withdrawn the day after I'd spent 3 hours on the phone with Salem General's financial assistance coordinator, trying to qualify for their hardship program. $15,000 had been moved to Jake's business account on the same day I'd applied for a second credit card because I'd maxed out the first one covering prescription costs that insurance didn't fully cover. But the federal investigation had uncovered something even worse than the systematic theft. Evidence that Jake and Ashley had been planning this from the moment they learned about my diagnosis. Text messages between them, recovered from Ashley's phone during the search warrant execution, showed that they'd discussed the GoFundMe campaign before I'd even had my surgery. Ashley had researched successful medical crowdfunding campaigns and had calculated how much money they could potentially raise based on my age, diagnosis, and social media reach. In one particularly damning exchange, Jake had texted Ashley saying, quote, "This could be exactly the startup capital we need for the food truck," just 3 days after I'd told him about my cancer diagnosis. Ashley had responded with research about optimal timing for campaign launches and strategies for maximizing emotional impact in the campaign description. They'd planned to steal from me before I'd even started treatment. While I was terrified about whether I'd survive cancer, they were calculating how to profit from my suffering. The betrayal wasn't impulsive or desperate. It was premeditated and methodical. The federal prosecutors had built an airtight case. Wire fraud for using electronic transfers to move stolen money across state lines. Mail fraud for using the Postal Service to send fake documentation to the GoFundMe platform. Conspiracy charges for Jake and Ashley working together to plan and execute the scheme. The sentencing guidelines suggested 15 to 20 years for the primary charges, and the prosecutors had made it clear they weren't interested in plea negotiations that didn't include significant prison time. Jake was about to learn what I discovered 6 years ago, that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences arrive with interest. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.